Hi, my name's Harry Kind, and when I was 16, I lost my home to a massive house fire, along with most of my possessions.
Hello, my name's Claire, and this man next to me, literally and in life, is Chris.
Welcome to The Silent Why, and loss 42 of 101, loss of possessions in a house fire.
We're on a podcast mission to see if it's possible to find hope in 101 different types of loss. But we're not just listing them. Oh no, we're also finding them.
Yep, we're finding people who've been through each loss so we can chat to them and hear their experiences of grief, loss and hope.
And first off, we want to thank you for listening. We really appreciate you for that. And if you find it helpful in any way, please share the podcast with a friend or others you know to help us spread these stories of hope.
In this episode, we want to introduce you to Harry Kind from Croydon in South London.
Just a mere 5 miles from where I was born.
But he actually grew up in Wales. He's a consumer rights expert now with Which, a comedy writer, and occasionally appears on radio and TV. And when Harry was a teenager, his family home caught fire late one night.
We had a loft conversion, the whole of the loft was gone, that was just like burnt rafters. Then our bedroom floor, the first floor, was fire damage, what I like to call all the way down to the P's in books.
Although Harry, his parents and his 2 siblings got out safely and no one was harmed, they lost almost all of the family's possessions to either the fire or the water damage as it was put out.
Harry considers what his parents must have been going through as he realises they're lost more now he's an adult, but also what he lost as a teenager.
The biggest thing I grieve is any pictures and kind of remnants of childhood. We don't have many pictures of me and my brother from growing up.
He also reflects on how the event has changed his life and shaped his character.
And I think I'm a different person for having had that level of responsibility then. And I can only hope it's made me a better person. But yes, I'm not sure I want to change it in a way because of that. Who I am now is partly because of that. And so I wouldn't want to risk it because I could be a horrible person then.
We kick this chat off by first complimenting Harry on his tech setup and then asking him to tell us a bit about himself. And then getting distracted by the fact that he writes jokes.
I'm Harry Kind, I live in Croydon, I grew up in Wales, and I work for Which magazine. So I help make their videos for social media, but also kind of represent them on national radio and TV.
And did I read as well, Harry, that you do bits of writing as in comedy writing or script writing and things?
I have, yes. So I'm in a little improv group, which is just kind of starting up. And also I did a course with the National Film and Television School, basically to do comedy writing. So I do a little bit of stuff on the radio. I've had a few jokes bought by the BBC for panel shows. And then I've got a few sitcom scripts, which I need to try and sell to people. But it's a little bit of a fun hobby at the moment.
This is not what we've got you on to talk about, but you just mentioned something that's intrigued me. How do you sell a joke?
I knew you were going to say that. How do you sell a joke to a panel show?
Amazing, right? Yeah, so there's a couple of open shows which have like writing pools. So there's the equivalent of the news quiz in Scotland, and Radio 4 usually has some kind of show for kind of young comedians where they're looking for topical gags. And so they'll have one-liners and they'll say, we want some one-liners on the week's news, or we want specific jokes about this kind of topic. You know, you send in a few, a few A4 pages worth, and they say, yeah, we'll have that one. It appears in someone else's mouth on the radio, and you get a nice check for, £20-30 in the post. I mean, it's not a way to earn a living, but it's nice. It's a something to frame.
That's amazing. I had no idea such a thing existed. Yeah. There you go. Learn something every day. Anyway, taking you back a few years, the reason that we've got you here is because of something that happened to you when you were younger. Tell us a little bit about what it was that you went through when you were 16.
Yes, so I'm 30 now. This is 14 years ago when I was living at home with my parents and my brother and sister in rural West Wales. And in the middle of the night, we had a house fire, which just burnt the whole thing down. And so we completely lost our house. And luckily, the most important thing, no one was hurt. So it's a very privileged kind of house fire to come out of, but it was a substantial loss at a very kind of monumental time of my life of being a kind of a teenager.
What started the fire? How did that actually happen?
Yeah, so, I mean, it was kind of middle of the night, and from some good luck, we were all awake. So, bearing in mind, my little sister was just 4 years old. She was just being put to bed, but it was 11 o'clock at night. I think we'd been away somewhere. And we're all kind of reading in bed and heard a banging from upstairs in the loft, which, had a loft conversion. We didn't really know what it was. I think my parents thought I'd been throwing just books from my bunk bed. And eventually Dad went upstairs to have a look. And I think basically the loft was full of smoke at this point, but there was no visible fire. And it turns out that there was a fire in the chimney. This is a kind of Victorian house, really quite old and probably badly built. And basically we had a wood-burning stove downstairs, which I'd lit that night, and then a spark from the fire had gone up and caught probably a rafter that was poking through into the chimney, and had set ablaze. And it's pretty hard to fight a fire that you can't actually see that's in the walls of the house. So we had no choice really but to leave straight away in our pajamas.
Just in the timeline, how quickly from that point on did it become evident that this was unstoppable, that there's no way that this fire is going out?
It was such an odd situation because it's it's a classic cliche of a question, isn't it? That if your house is burning down, what do you take with you? And, realistically, we feel like we're in situations where the house could burn down quite a lot of the time. But if every time the smoke alarm went off and you grabbed all of your family photos and took them outside, you'd look a little bit foolish. So I knew that Dad was kind of taking it very seriously. He'd taken us all out into the car. And so we were probably there for about half an hour with not a visible fire. It was, we couldn't actually see anything. And while he was running in and out, grabbing important, valuable things, and we were waiting for the fire brigade, we basically realised that it was best for us as the kids and for Mum to go and spend the night with my grandma, because we weren't going to be waiting around all night for what we kind of hoped was a put-outable fire. It's difficult thinking back to think whether we were of the mentality of, oh, it's all gone, or whether we thought, oh, it will be all over, because we hadn't seen a fire. So we left my dad there. It took at least an hour for the fire brigade to arrive and get working. And I think probably by 3 a.m. it was apparent that it was all gone. There was not much to rescue.
So at that point, presume you were at your grandparents' house, and then you woke up the next morning with the question on your mind, what happened?
Yeah, I think it's this mad situation. We've got phones. I'm in my dressing gown. I had kind of gotten the wherewithal to go, right, we should let my grandmother, who lived quite nearby, know that if she sees the house across the valley on fire, we're safe. Let her know. Go to my other grandparents, call them before we get there, and be ready. I think we stayed up quite late watching reruns of Monty Python, and then woke up in the morning really with a kind of very practical sense of like, we're probably going to have to call people to say that we're not going to be in school, or text some friends. And it was before everyone being constantly in text contact. You go through those kind of things, and it's difficult to know whether it's an excuse for a day off or something terrible. I don't think we had photos of it at that point. We were, a 10-minute drive away. Mum must have spoken to Dad at that point. But I think we were actually, as kids, I think probably assumed it had all gone, I think, at that point. I think, especially because, you're not really familiar with fires as a kid. You don't often see enough of them that you go, oh, well, you can have a minor house fire. You can have a kitchen go up in smoke, and that's fine. And so it wasn't until, I think it was probably the next day, that we went and visited. But it was such a state that you, even from the outside, you couldn't tell, because the whole thing was roped off and, unable to go in because it was dangerous. And I'm not sure when we got the pictures through from my dad, who'd stayed around with his camera to take photos of the fire in motion, that we really saw, oh, right, this has been quite substantial. And, just for the level of what it was, we had a loft conversion. The whole of the loft was gone. That was just like burnt rafters. Then our bedroom floor, the first floor, was fire damage, what I like to call all the way down to the P's in books. So the top of the bookshelves were completely gone, and then anything under P was fine, except for everything had been water damaged. So anything downstairs, anything on the first floor, our bedrooms, and then everything that had been in the loft was completely gone.
I'm curious as to how you feel about that as a 16-year-old boy, because as a young child I can picture that you might lose teddies and you lose things that are very valuable to you that you want back at that point, and then you get a bit older, and then teenage years could go one way or the other, really. How did you feel about losing possessions at that age?
Yeah, I think in the moment I was very much of the kind of I was prioritizing. I think I had some coursework on my laptop that I was keen to make sure that was safe. I wanted to make sure my phone was okay, which it was. For some reason, it was hiding behind something metal, and so had survived. So those have been my priorities, and in a little bit, that wasn't so much of a, oh, this is something I've lost, more than I want to be able to continue using this thing. You want to get back to normal. You want to go back in and get some clothes, because this week you've got to have clothes, this week you've got to have a phone, this week get your homework in. So those were the things that I was immediately concerned with. And looking after my little brother and sister, because they were just a little bit like not fully understanding what was going on. After that, though, there was a little bit, as a teenager, of a sense of, well, actually, there are quite a few things that I have here that I felt quite guilty for not having used in a while. I had a lot of tat had built up, expensive gifts that my parents had bought me that I'd not nearly played with enough to justify, how much they'd spent, or a load of books that I'd not read. And so, those kind of feelings start coming in where you're like, I've been let off the hook here a little bit.
I was just trying to think, as a teenager, what did I kind of treasure in that way? But phones weren't around when I was a teenager, so the phone thing probably wouldn't have come in. So is there one memory or one specific thing that you think about most when, like, as a personal thing, when you think back over that?
Yeah, the smell is really distinctive. And it is the most emotive of the senses, people say, and it's so old and primal. And everything afterwards that you've managed to salvage smells of a particular kind of burnt. It's kind of slightly, it's chemically and slightly plasticky, but also quite a nice, earthy, smoky smell. I quite like a smoky smell. So everything would smell like that. All the books would smell like that for ages afterwards. That was something I'd remembered for a while, and that kind of fades. And then the other day, there was a fire in Croydon, a restaurant near me burnt down. And after that, the street smelled exactly the same. I hadn't smelt it since. It was incredible how similar it was. And that just took me back straight away, not to the fire, but to the kind of weeks afterwards of the recovery and the rebuilding, which the moment of the loss, really, the fire, it is but a moment, whereas the long rebuilding of the whole thing, that's where most of the memories come from, was where we were living, rebuilding the house, salvaging, sorting through all of the bits of burnt possessions to try and get some kind of recovery.
When you say it took me back, what does it take you back to? Is it, your memories, are they sad? Are they just like, oh yeah, remember that? That was a memorable experience. What does it take you back to?
I think it's a really odd kind of period to experience that kind of momentous thing to happen. I think especially as a guy, that I was very much of the I've got to be the strong oldest kid to look after brother and sister, and not really, I don't think, engaging with emotions from it. And then to be reminded of it, it felt a little bit like the emotion or the emotional memory was the kind of lack of that, was the lack of having any kind of like breakdown from it. The fact that it was just so surreal, and actually looking back, it's this kind of odd kind of moment of, I don't really remember feeling too much loss or sadness or panic. But looking back at that now, you're like, that's so weird. And it does feel like a little bit of an empty gap for that. But then also just reminds me of family as well, because it was not far from being one of the last times where I was living at home with the whole family there all the time, of childhood. And just thinking back to how my parents managed to keep everything together throughout it. I guess I kind of realised in those points just how lucky I had it, really.
When we speak to most people, we ask them if the why question has factored in at all. Like, why me? Why did this happen? Why us? Sort of thing. Did that factor in? Because I'm not sure if that is a question that even passes through your mind at that age. Does that feel like something that you ever thought about?
I don't think we ever did. I'm sure my parents did. When we moved to that house, it was a wreck. My dad spent years and years doing it up, and it was pretty much just about ready. It was just about done. He's a builder, so it's always the last project, and it had just about come to completion, and then it all went. So I should imagine he was thinking a certain amount of why now? Could have happened any time in the past. It was coming weeks after my mum had put her wedding dress in the loft, so that went when it would have otherwise been fine. Why now for that? As kids, I don't think, in a way, it was like, oh, of course it'd be us. Like, of course, it's the Kind family who goes through this. Not through any kind of like, oh, woe is us. We're a wild, adventurous kind of weirdos. And so, especially at that age, you have this kind of narrative of Famous Five and living in a book or a film, that this is the event that would happen to a family. And then weirdly, around that time, all sorts of random stuff went wrong, in that my granddad became very ill. I got cancer while we were in the recovery of while the house was being rebuilt. And I'm not sure if it was before or after that my uncle died. We had a lot of stuff happen, and it all felt like part of a parcel of just like, oh, this is a big challenge that we're all facing. And looking back at it now, the why and all of that is around like my poor mum. The amount that she would have had to deal with for that, which as kids we were fine with, but she just had everything happen at once and must have been thinking why. But no, luckily we were like, oh yeah, why not? That was the why.
Your poor parents, they must have really went through the ringer with that one.
Yeah.
I guess at the time you probably didn't realise how big it would have been for them, or did you?
No, I don't think I did realise. And, when I was ill afterwards, I did feel a kind of like, it's a bit more focused on you than when you're ill, that you can then feel, oh, don't worry about me, I'm worried about my mum in all this. But when the fire's happening to everyone equally, you don't necessarily realise the burden of being the responsible adult and trying to keep everyone together, that it just must have been so tiring. I just can't imagine, even now in my flat, which is not a very personal space. It's not where I've got children or, decades of life. To lose that would be just so tiring. But yes, at the time, I hope looking back that we were good, happy children who lent a hand. And I should probably imagine the thing that we did was not complain. We just weren't a complaining bunch of kids. But, oh gosh, just the amount of tiring, sleepless nights it must have taken for them.
Are you okay now, health-wise? Was that short-lived treatment, or was it?
It was the mild cancer. 1 chili out of 5. Yes, I was very lucky with that, and it was all taken out and dealt with. But it meant that there was a period where we were all living in the loft as the house was being rebuilt from the top down. We were all sharing one room, and there were one bed and then some mattresses, and I got promoted to the big bed while my parents slept on the floor because I was ill. And that was like a kind of Charlie Bucket situation. It was very odd.
So, as part of this podcast series that we're doing, exploring all sorts of different types of loss, really, there's a core quote almost that we stick to. All loss needs to be recognised, needs to be grieved. Do you look back 14 years ago upon this as something that was a loss, something that should be grieved, or is it all quite sort of surface and we dealt with it and all is well?
I think the biggest thing I grieve is any pictures and kind of remnants of childhood. We don't have many pictures of me and my brother from growing up, but we have loads, dozens of my little sister, because that was digitized. Or people now. My girlfriend's got a little nephew, and the number of pictures and the constant recording of his life is amazing. And that is something that we just don't have, like, we have barely any photos of ourselves. There's actually a great picture that we do have post-fire, which is a load of our family photos in the bath, trying to wash off a load of the dirt and separate them out from the water damage and the fire damage, just in a fire damaged bath being kind of recovered. And, you know, I think we've got a few of those. That is a loss. But a lot of the loss of the house is so surreal because we rebuilt the house and my parents still live there, and they rebuilt it better, slightly different, but better. And so it's a bit like how memory is like a trick of, you imagine the house being bigger and being different when you were younger. Well, it was a different house. And so that one moment that happened that was the before and after, it messes with your memory quite a bit, but also in a way slots in very nicely to how memory actually works, I think.
I just keep thinking about your poor dad who stayed with the house when you left, and just sort of watching it happen and taking the photos and sort of processing. He must have just kept thinking of new things that you were losing. Have they ever talked about how they processed all that?
We've had bits of conversation about that, and I think, you know, I'm very appreciative of how they parented and how he parented in all of that. I can't imagine being just alone in that moment, just watching everything go up in smoke. And yeah, as you were saying, just thinking about those individual things. But, you know, and I said this to him the other day, maybe even via talking about it on the radio, just that is a model, and how he and Mum recovered from it and looked after us is just a model for like how I want to live. Of just being someone who can, you don't want to be the stiff upper lip repressing every emotion, but to have that kind of worst thing happen. In some ways it's like the worst thing that can happen in a moment that doesn't hurt anyone, that requires the most to recover from, other than maybe going to jail. But just to be able to deal with that and to never show us worry. Like, I think sadness was always like apparent, but never to show us like a kind of, how are we going to deal with this? What's going to happen? There was never any sense of that. And that is something that I have tried to bring into my life since then. And I do think it has massively changed how I see crisis and how our family sees crisis. You know, when COVID happened, my instinct was to go home, to go to be with the family, and actually not to worry too much, because the most important thing is just like, get Beth, my partner, get a couple of our friends, go back to home base, because we'll be able to see through this storm very easily together, which is what we did, and kind of hid in the house that had burnt down 12 years earlier for the 4 worst months of COVID.
I like when you referred to your cancer, you sort of have this measure of it being a mild 1 out of 5 chilies. If you were speaking on behalf of your parents, how do you think, with the things that you mentioned were sort of lining up, how many chilies would your parents, do you think, have given the house fire out of 5?
I think the house fire is, in a way, was like for them, was probably like the level setting on a video game. Are you going to play this in easy mode or in hard mode? And the struggles of everything else were the challenge, and the fire was just like, we're going to put everything on hard mode. We're just going to make it so that you're not in a comfortable space when you're dealing with hospital appointments, or, you know, we don't have somewhere we can host family if they're ill, or to come and visit. The house fire is just, it's a lot of admin, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of physical work. I think probably I'm sure there was an emotional component to it, which is probably maybe 3 out of 5 on that, but it mainly, I think, was how it affected everything else, and just makes it all the harder.
There's so many facets to it, and I think people would not necessarily understand, especially when no one was hurt. I feel like it's the kind of thing they would have told people, and the response might quite easily have been, starting with words we're supposed to never use in grief, at least no one was hurt, at least you all got out, yes, at least you kept your lives, and all that kind of thing, which, yes, you know, on one level you're like, yes, true, that's a huge blessing, but the other stuff that we've been left with and the other things we've lost, even though they're physical and their possessions maybe, the ongoing impact of that. I mean, we lost some photos, which we did an episode about because I dropped a hard drive. I think it's about 5 years of photos just vanished. And they were mainly just the two of us going on holiday and stuff. I can't imagine what that would be like if you're talking about your children and, you know, all those kinds of things. And they were hard copies that you lost. And we keep remembering stuff that that we lost in the photos. And again, if you've got a whole house, it must just keep going on and on. Oh yeah, I forgot we lost this. Oh yeah, I forgot we lost this. Or I'll go and get this. Oh no, we haven't got that because it was in the house. It must have just been one of those relentless losses that just goes on for a really long time.
I need to stop you, actually, because of the podcast that we do. We've learned that even the words "I can't imagine" aren't helpful.
That's true. We're not supposed to say that either.
Do imagine what it was like for the parents to lose.
I can imagine. It would be awful.
Yeah,
it would just keep going on and on.
Absolutely, and of course you lose physical possessions throughout your whole life, right? It does make that a lot easier. You're not too attached to anything in a way. So like losing photos. It's like double-edged sword in a way. On the one hand, I don't worry too much about losing things or not needing to. I don't feel like I need too many things, and I feel like I shouldn't buy too many things because I know that I don't need them. On the other hand, I'm very much aware of like, oh, I should back things up. Like I back up my photos a lot. I appreciate things being in the cloud. I appreciate being able to, go onto an email address wherever I am in the world and access things. That kind of side of things is definitely, that impacts how I feel about owning physical things.
And yet you work for an organisation, a magazine that reviews products and encourages people to buy or not to buy.
Exactly. I know. What does that say? And that's a real interesting one because I'm very much the person who's saying the best washing machine is the one that you've got already. You don't need to buy more things. If only we bought less stuff. And we've always been that kind of family, I think. We've always been we're not a very gadgety family, not a very fashionable family. We never really... We didn't have a huge amount of money growing up, but a lot of what we had was a kind of a homemade, bodged together thing. And so, yes, it is odd that I now work in something that is telling people to buy stuff. At the same time, a lot of what Which has been doing recently is dangerous products, testing dangerous products that are for sale online. And so the second time in a few years that I smelt the smell of the fire was last week when I went to a fire testing facility and we tried to get some mini electric heaters that we bought online to catch fire in the fire testing room. And that fire testing room smelt exactly like the house. Except this time when I went in, the fire brigade said, oh, make sure you wear a mask in there, even when there's not a fire, because that stuff's like really carcinogenic. And I'm thinking, wow, we spent quite a bit of time roaming through the wreckage of our house fire, and we weren't wearing any masks. We didn't even think about that.
We talked to people a lot about hope as well. And again, at a young age, I don't know if that's a concept that factors in much. What has hope had to do with this journey? Have you seen that in any form and where?
I think it is a very clear story of we lost it all and then rebuilt. We will rebuild it. It's like the classic statement that people make. And that where there is loss, there is the potential to recover. And, the house, we rebuilt it in a way that was better for us. My dad put an extension on, and that's not something that you can do if you lose a family member. You can't go, we got a new family member and they're better, they can play tennis. It's an odd thing, but you do though have that hopeful moment of just like, oh, actually we're back now to a bit of normality. And so you have that hope, but also a kind of, it's a slight sense of, I don't want to say like invincibility, but something like that happens, you do just go, oh, we dealt with that. that worked quite well, and it gives you hope that if bad things happen to you in future, you can deal with them.
And on a similar note, how would you compare it? Do you compare it? Do you avoid comparing it to other types of loss that you experience that you may hear about? Is it there on a scale, in a sense, of something that comes to your head, your heart, when you hear about others going through grief and loss?
It's so difficult to compare, and I think I don't see it in the same category at all as people who've dealt with that kind of loss, especially because we came out the other side of it. If we had ended up homeless, if we hadn't had insurance covering it, if we had really, really had a massive change in circumstances that was permanent, I would then compare it to bigger losses. I am comparing it, but it was a temporary thing, and that was something that means I guess I don't compare it to those things. I think probably it does make me then compare other people losing things to that. or anything else I lose in my life that is a physical thing, I just don't really mind too much. I think that if I lose some possessions, I'm like, you know what? Yeah, fine, I've done that. And that's the other weird thing, is that beyond photos, I can't think of a single thing that I would bring back from before the fire. You know, a single possession that I own particularly that was just like, oh, I really miss that item. And that is a very odd thing to be aware of, because I love my stuff that I've got now. I'm a hoarder. I don't want to get rid of things now. But to know that there was a point in my life where everything went and none of it was valuable, really. It was all useful, it was all necessary, but none of it beyond a few sentimental bits and pieces was really that important to me. It makes life a little lighter, I think.
And I can't work out in my own head whether that's how you've always been, or has that been because of the fire episode?
Definitely partly because of the fire episode, I think. We weren't very possession focused, but we were, I guess, emotional and attached to things, and we wouldn't want to throw anything out, or, you know, we would collect memories. I'm still someone who collects a memory box, but I can't even think of things that I would have had. So yeah, it's a difficult thing almost. It makes you reconsider everything, and then you go, oh, I mean, what am I, spending all this money on stuff for? Like what? I keep on doing it, but it's clearly not that meaningful to me. Am I wasting my life buying this stuff? Probably yes. So yeah, I don't know. I do think it must have had an effect on how I feel about stuff. It must have.
Do you think you're a better adult because of it?
Definitely, 100%. Yeah, definitely. Both on the kind of personal things. I don't know what I'd have been like as a teenager if it hadn't happened. It was a really big moment. I was 16, my little sister was 4, so already quite a big age gap there. But then to have dad busy doing the house, mum busy with all sorts of stuff, and then to spend time with Grace, I must have been very aware of just wanting to give her a bit of stability and a bit of fun and everything. And that is a challenge. And if it hadn't happened, I could have been off doing all sorts. I could have been off partying and doing drugs, and that wasn't an option. And I think I'm a different person for having had that level of responsibility then. And I can only hope it's made me a better person. And, my little sister is an incredible woman now who has achieved so much and wasn't so messed up by the experience. And I hope that I helped with that. But yes, I'm not sure I want to change it in a way because of that. Who I am now is partly because of that. And so I wouldn't want to risk it, because I could be a horrible person now.
It sounds like almost what you're saying that your little sister Grace would say about you would say about your parents. I get the impression that you're really thankful for the way your parents led the family through it. It sounds like your parents were pretty incredible as well.
They were. They really were incredible. And yes, I have a lot to thank them for. And that is just a real model for how I want to live and how eventually I'd want to be a parent. But I need to have a talk to them, really, about how they felt with it. I think they've probably got a lot of unprocessed emotions from it, a lot of unprocessed feelings, because there is just so much admin to do. People who lose family members know that there's just so much death admin to do. And at the end of that tunnel, only then you can really process stuff. And actually, the ratio of loss to admin in a house fire is quite low. There's a lot of admin. And the battles keep on going, I suppose. You've got to battle for the insurance. You've got to try and clean the things, buy new things, build a house. It doesn't give you much time to process the emotions. And I think now they're probably doing that now. I'd love to talk to them, and I should talk to them about how they remember it. And it must have been dark for them, and just how they got through it.
It sounds like there was just so much going on for them that they had to prioritise. Even just looking after a 4-year-old on its own would have been quite a big thing to have done, let alone having 2 other children and then one of them going through cancer and then the death of family members and all that going on. I feel like it's the kind of thing you wouldn't actually even get time to stop and think about or grieve properly until, like you said, maybe much further down the line. So it sounds like you've all done it in a very good way.
Yeah. I think we have. And hopefully a healthy way. But as you say, there's a lot of work in dealing with a 4-year-old, that was probably quite difficult for them. A 16-year-old doesn't actually need much stuff. They like stuff. They don't need much stuff. Kids need stuff to keep them busy and to keep them clean. And so that was probably difficult for them. We were very lucky in that a load of people came out and supported us through all that, and actually, whether it was clothes, even at the church that I'd been baptized in years and years before, I hadn't been to in years, bought me a laptop to replace the old one. And it's that kind of thing that's surreal, because you kind of think, oh, not that I don't deserve this, but why us? But then also just the number of people, the family who came out and filled wheelbarrows with possessions and soot and ash to put on a dump or to help, rebuild a roof eventually. That was incredible as well.
That's really interesting that the why us question came in with the good stuff that people were helping you with, maybe more than with the fire itself.
Probably yes. I think the at least question is something that I often say. Obviously, at least no one was hurt. But also, at least we had a community, we had family nearby to fall back on. So we had the perfect fire, right? In that we could go and stay with my grandparents in their big house, stay there for a month. Then we can go back to where the house is, to our property, and we had a holiday cottage that we would rent out. That was, my parents had it as a business that we could live in while the house was being rebuilt. I mean, that's a way to burn your house down, right? Is to have a backup house next door. And so we lived in that backup house. We had a Christmas in that backup house. That's the real, at least, is that at least we were really able to do that. And so I think the why us, why were we getting that support, particularly from the church and from, I think probably from strangers even, and people that we barely knew. You kind of think, oh, there's so many people who go through this or go through worse who don't have that inbuilt support to then have what is effectively financial support on top. That felt like, oh, that's privilege upon privilege, I suppose, but very thankful for it.
We came across you talking about this because you tweeted about it on the 14th anniversary of the fire. Do you tweet every anniversary? And if not, why the 14th anniversary? Why broadcast this anniversary of this loss?
Good question. I think in this case, my mum had sent through the picture of the newspaper clipping on the family WhatsApp group. I think she's probably pretty on it in terms of pointing out every anniversary. And on that occasion, I thought it's something I often bring up with people. I have got the photos ready at the drop of a hat to show people, because I think it's a little bit of a would I lie to you kind of story that you can say and you know that there's a happy ending, and that's quite nice. So I think it was just a few things lining up that it was this anniversary. But, every anniversary we do mention it. We say this was when it happened. Haven't we all come along a long way? And I suppose just be very thankful that you wouldn't know it to spend time with us, that we've had this big thing happen.
And we have an opportunity to give a bit of public service information, and you can insult me as much as you want. We've lived in our house 5 years, and I've not got round to considering what to buy, like a fire extinguisher or a fire blanket. So what would you say to me in that regard?
Well, this is where I'm terrible, because I've actually just started looking for a fire extinguisher. I will be buying one of those, actually. I think it's definitely worth having if you've got any bigger house. Being on top of the smoke alarms, of course, so many people just aren't. But it's a good question, because I'm a bit of a pyromaniac, which, I think I was a pyromaniac before as well. So I'm quite risky with fire. I know fire. I think it's good to know fire. I think it's really interesting how difficult it is to burn down a house, because stuff doesn't want to catch on fire. And so probably I would say, especially if you're raising kids, is to know how fire works is a really good thing to know, because then you're very aware of how quickly things can go up in smoke in the right situation, but also that you shouldn't be worried about certain things. You shouldn't fear fire. And if you've got a big fire extinguisher, all the better. You're probably fine, right? So, we will, because we're in the countryside, have bonfires all the time. Go and light a fire on the beach. But because we grew up with a log burning stove, we know that you don't light a fire with a big stick of wood, and other people will come and be terrified that the whole woods are going to catch on fire or something like that. I guess, yes. Know your enemy is what I'd say. Know your enemy.
If I was a detective, I'd be listening to you talking about being a pyromaniac. I'd remember the start of the conversation where, with the glint in your eye, you said, "I'd lit the log burning fire the night of the fire."
Exactly.
And be questioning you.
Do you know, I think it was the insurance investigators or the fire investigators afterwards were really trying to suggest that maybe either me or my brother had been secretly smoking out of the window, and that somehow the fag end had got blown out of the window and then gone back up into the guttering and caused the roof to burn down. And it's like, yeah, I just find that unlikely, since neither of us are smokers and the fire was coming from inside the house.
On the news clipping, I loved that it said that they used 4 water jets and breathing apparatus. And I was like, you don't really get that anymore in news articles. You don't get what they used and how the fire was put out.
Front page local news. And actually, you know, that was a point of contention for us, because we got the overnight volunteer firefighters who didn't know what they were doing. We were very far from the nearest water point and they didn't know how to use the foam. So it did use 4 water jets, but it could have been maybe dealt with a bit quicker if the professionals were involved. I think it was maybe something like, it was either 45 minutes until the police came or 45 minutes until the fire service came, but that was after police and ambulance had turned up. And they battled through the night, but it was a case of going back and forth to the local village to fill up with water. Not the best.
Final question, as we end every episode. What is your Herman?
So I think my Herman would be, and I suppose it comes in the form of a melted remote control plane, which was a gift that I had received and was very expensive and I hadn't played with enough. And that is a kind of reminder to me that after that had gone, I felt a real relief from a guilt of being attached to this item. And so in my current life, I suppose, I just think that there's not a huge amount that I should ever really invest too much in as a single item or as any kind of item, because ultimately everything's replaceable. There's nothing really that's of much value. And the important things, without being a cliche, are family and your health. And those are the things that are a lot more enjoyable, and you won't feel guilty about spending time with them.
How many of us have heard the message that family, friends and health are the things that really matter in this world, but have yet to go through an experience that really concretes that for us? It's a shame, but so often in life it's the traumatic things that we endure that really teach us the life lessons that matter.
To find out more about Harry, why not follow him on Twitter @HarryKind. And for more about us, visit thesilentwhy.com or on social media @thesilentwhypod, where you can find photos of our guests, Claire's regular blog, where we're up to with the official 101 losses list, and we'll put links to all of that in the show notes, and also some of Harry's fire photos on our social media too.
And if you like what we're offering here and want to ensure it keeps going, please tell a friend about our podcast or consider sharing it on social media, or support my work through buymeacoffee.com/thesilentwhy. We're finishing this episode with a small story that came to my mind when I was hearing Harry talk about possessions and what's really important. It was something I read many years ago, but it never really left me.
There are many variations on this story, the popular one being called The Mexican Fisherman, but the original is thought to have been written by a German man called Heinrich Theodor Bull, who was also a recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1972. This is a summary.
The story is set in an unnamed harbour on the west coast of Europe. A smartly dressed enterprising tourist is taking photographs when he notices a shabbily dressed local fisherman taking a nap in his fishing boat. The tourist is disappointed with the fisherman's apparently lazy attitude towards his work, so he approaches the fisherman and asks him why he is lying around instead of catching fish. The fisherman explains that he went fishing in the morning and the small catch would be sufficient for the next 2 days. The tourist tells him that if he goes out to catch fish multiple times a day, he would be able to buy a motor in less than a year, and a second boat in less than 2 years, and so on. The tourist further explains that one day the fisherman could even build a small cold storage plant, later a pickling factory, fly around in a helicopter, build a fish restaurant, and export lobster directly to Paris without a middleman. The nonchalant fisherman asks, then what? The tourist enthusiastically continues. Then, without a care in the world, you could sit here in the harbour, doze in the sun, and look at the glorious sea. But I'm already doing that, says the fisherman. The enlightened tourist walks away pensively, with no trace of pity for the fisherman, only a little envy.